Good morning. It's so lovely to be with you. As Elizabeth already said, we had such a great day yesterday with all your women. I hope you men realize how lucky you are. What a fantastic bunch of women are in this church. And I was saying to the women yesterday, it's so lovely. You know, my parents travel all the time. They travel all over the world. I'm always hear about these different places that they've been to. So it's just really lovely to be able to come and to see, you know, one of the places that they get to spend time in. And I have to say, I've just had such a warm welcome, and thank you so much for kind of being willing to kind of take me in as well. I say I get to hang on to their coattails, so it feels really good. And it's a real privilege to get to speak to you this morning. For those of you who are Priscilla fans, I feel like you've been a little bit duped. But in fairness, I think I was a bit duped as well. So when we were planning this weekend, Mum said to me, you know, you could speak on Sunday morning. And I said, okay, that's fine. And then very quickly added, it's 3 services. So yes, I'm ready. I'm ready for it. Although, having said that, after you know, being with you guys yesterday, and getting into bed last night, feeling a little bit tired, to then at 1:45 being rudely awoken by the fire alarm in the hotel. And so I was scrambling out of bed and getting the shoes and the coat on, and then racing out the door to realize that it had just gone off again. So, but I'm here for the long haul this morning. It's lovely, you know, it's lovely having your parents, you know, with you while you're speaking, but it does feel a little bit like, with these 4 in front of me, like the X Factor judging panel. And I'm a little bit worried that by the 3rd time listening to me, that they'll have managed to unpick all the theological inaccuracies in my talk. So so wish me luck. I wonder if you'll read with me this morning, and perhaps the verses will pop up behind me. We're going to read this morning together from John 20, verses 11 to 18. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw 2 angels in white, seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. And Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. Now, some of you are maybe checking your calendars to make sure that I didn't think I'd showed up on Easter Sunday morning. It is, yes, still September. For one more day, and I haven't got my dates confused, and sometimes I wonder why we only allow ourselves to look at some of these texts at Easter time. And you know, just sometimes it happens when you've been in it, reading a passage of scripture, and you just can't quite get away from it. And I haven't been able to get away from this passage for the past couple of months. And some of you women who were here last night will be thinking, well, we looked at this passage last night, but we looked at it for an entirely different reason. As women last night, we looked at it as Mary as the apostle to the apostles, who was called and sent out as a woman, shockingly enough. But that's, of course, a different subject for a different day. But I just have been drawn back to this text time and time again, because there's so much going on in this interaction. And of course, often the focus of this passage and this text is, of course, and rightly so, the good news that Jesus has risen from the dead. But I want us this morning to just look at what Mary's story speaks to us about. So at the start of this passage, just before, we know that Jesus is dead, and we know that most of the 12 have already abandoned Jesus. They've gone and they're hiding. And it's the women who have stayed by the tomb. And you know, even when they realize the tomb's empty and they come running to see it for themselves, we read that the men leave and they go back to where they've been hiding. But Mary stays by this empty tomb. And the thing that we need to remember is that it isn't a tomb that yet signifies a risen Jesus as it does to us. Mary doesn't know this yet. All that it signifies to Mary is just another in a long line of disappointments. And the truth is that maybe some of us, and probably more than a few of us, have found ourselves where Mary is standing in that moment. The place where hope is hard. And you and I know the ending of the story, and we've been singing about it this morning, and we live in the light of this tremendous story. But just sometimes the darkness of the small story means hope is just hard to find. And we know that we're called to be people of hope. We carry a great resurrection hope, and it is an incredible thing. And then why then just sometimes does it feel like hope is just beyond our reach? Perhaps a little bit like Mary must have felt in the garden. I used to think that I was quite an optimistic person until I met my husband. Now, he's a salesman, so I'd say there's a fine line between optimism and exaggeration. And if you ever meet him, just bear that in mind. But he is generally just one of the most optimistic people that I know. In fact, I remember a while back when he was asked to just share a little bit about what I would have described as our fledgling, struggling church plant. And after he'd shared about our church community, he sat down beside me and I leaned over and I whispered, "I'd like to go to that church." But it really is. It's a great thing to live with an optimist. But sometimes I think that it's easy to confuse hope with optimism, isn't it? I hope it doesn't rain tomorrow. I hope my children sleep in the morning. I hope I do well in my exams. But what has that little word hope come to mean when it's used so often in our vocabulary? And what is it about a biblical hope that makes us distinct from just optimists? And how do we have a hope that endures when life gets hard? And as we experience life's disappointments, how do we, like Mary, stay by the empty tomb to encounter a risen Jesus? And if you're here this morning, you're thinking, I haven't really had to ask myself those questions just yet. Take it from me, you will at some point. Because as Walter Brueggemann, the theologian, I think so brilliantly sums up our life of faith, he describes it as moving with God from a place of being securely oriented around God. And perhaps that's when we first encounter Jesus and the good news of the gospel. And sometimes it's just when life is going well, all is as it should be. We're in the safe place of feeling that life is good and God is where he should be. And then often our life of faith moves from this being safely oriented to a often painful disorientation. When situations or experiences drive us to the edge of what it is to be human and to know God. And then to being surprisingly reoriented around who God really is. And that picture kind of sums up for me what's happening to Mary in this passage. From being just securely oriented with Jesus, things had been going well, things were good, to the sudden disorientation of a dead Jesus and an empty tomb that gives way to Mary being reoriented around who Jesus really is. And if this picture is true for all of us in our journey of faith, then sometimes I think we have a bit of a language problem in church. Now, my eldest daughter recently, there's been a lot of chat in school about, words that you're not supposed to say. And she's been very intrigued by this. And I think half the time there's plenty of kids, making out like they know what they're talking about. And of course, the big word, which do not fear, I am not going to say, but there's one word, begins with the letter F, and there's a great excitement to discover what that means. So we're driving in the car and she's asking me, and I'm just keeping tight-lipped. She's dying to know. And my middle child pipes up. She said, I know what the F word is. And I'm thinking, do you? And then she says, it's fun. So I just smiled and nodded and said, yes, that is exactly what it is. And sometimes in church it's a little bit like that. There's certain words that we don't quite know how to handle, and so we come up with an alternative that sounds a little bit better. The G word, grief. The D word, disappointment or doubt. What do we do with those words? And we're not quite sure what language to put around them. I've heard it called a solar Christianity, where the sun is always shining, where we only have language of victory and certainty and assurance. And often it feels like we're expected to speak that language in church, or at least to pretend that that's how we're feeling. But if we're being honest, our common experience is not often the one of the safe orientation or equilibrium. But when we start to give expression to our own painful experiences and disappointments, we don't have to move very far to encounter it in one another. I know in our own small church community, in the past couple of years, we have faced financial difficulties, marriage difficulties, health issues, mental health issues, addiction, depression, loss, self-esteem issues, infertility, and I probably could go on. And we have, as a community, I feel, has had to make a sort of a difficult and at times frightening movement towards real and honest talk. A wee bit more like a lunar Christianity rather than a solar Christianity, where we do allow language of despair and disappointment and frustration to be present. What happens to our hope when our world doesn't work out the way we think it should? And if anything challenges your theology of hope, it is the pain of loss. And I'm not just talking about death, I'm talking about loss in many shapes and forms in our life. And the disciples and Mary, they've just lost Jesus. And things have not gone to plan. Look, I know this isn't always the easiest of subjects to engage with. And I am a visiting speaker, so when I go, you can just pretend that I wasn't here if you want. And if you came here this morning and you were feeling upbeat and good about life, my intention is not to bring you down. Maybe you can just take notes for future reference at some point and put them to the side. But, I am just being, I suppose, honest to my own journey over the past couple of years, that I have been learning and wrestling with this question that so much of our life and faith is this living in this tension. And how do we live in the tension of being people of this great hope and live in the reality of our often painful lives? You see, I remember as though it were yesterday, my own disorientation. And they're often very hard to forget, those moments. And if you aren't sure if you've had one, you'll know it when it happens. And maybe it came a little bit later to me in my Christian life, and perhaps this was the reason that it was truly like an erosion of my equilibrium. Because it was the day in my world where everything changed. And probably for the first time properly, the language of grief and of disappointment and despair entered my faith vocabulary. And if you were here yesterday, some of the women will have already heard this part of my story, but a little under 4.5 years ago, I was expecting our third child. And everything had been going as it should have been as pregnancies go, and I was pretty overdue, as I was with all of my babies. So I was almost 2 weeks overdue, and my waters broke, and so we left home to go to the hospital to what we believed was to give birth to our baby. And on arriving in the hospital, to discover that there was no longer a heartbeat. And a couple of hours later, I delivered our beautiful, perfect little boy, who we named Jude. And that was the beginning of my disorientation. This was not part of the plan. And so when I read this passage of scripture with Mary, I get what it felt like. Mary is distraught. Her whole world has been turned upside down. And Jesus tried to tell them. He tried to warn them. And yet they still weren't prepared for this moment. And it is often that way for most of us. Life is good, and then suddenly, how many of us have experienced that? I can't believe you let this happen to me, God. And now all I have is an empty tomb. And she is so overwhelmed with her grief. Now, we know from reading the scripture that Jesus is already there, but Mary hasn't seen him yet. And it's so often in these moments that our temptation is to rush past the hard part, to get to the good part. We want to get back to the safety of the sun, and we like recovery stories that kind of quickly move through the dark so we get to the sweeping redemptive ending, or as a good Northern Irish Christian calls it, to the testimony. And, I don't know if you've experienced that. It's okay to say life's hard, but you've got to quickly follow it up by saying, but God is good. And, the truth is that in these moments of disappointment, and it's washing over us, and we're desperately trying to get our heads and our hearts around what is not going to be or what is going to be, and the death of our expectations can be painful beyond measure. And so, for anyone who's ever felt like they have to get to the end of the story, the Bible never seems to do that. And I love this moment. The angels are in the tomb and they know what's happened. They're hanging out and Mary is there. And they don't just greet her and say, "Oh, Mary, get over it. He's over there. It's all right." They ask her why she's crying. And look, I was reading this the other day and I was thinking, I was hearing the voice of my middle child, who is probably my father personified in girl form. And all I could hear was that exasperated, "What are you crying for?" Which would be so like her to say it. But when I read this passage, that's not how I hear the angels speaking to Mary. They're giving her permission to express what she is feeling. And in the same way, the language of the Psalms puts anguish out into the open and voices it as a prayer. Psalm 56:8, "Record my misery, list my tears on your scroll. Are they not in your record?" And Eugene Peterson reminds us how the psalmists, they don't look on suffering as something slightly embarrassing that we have to hush up or lock it up in a closet, because that sort of thing doesn't happen to a person of good faith. Or it doesn't treat it as a puzzle that has to be explained. In the scriptures, we see suffering is set out squarely, openly, passionately before God, acknowledged, expressed, described, and lived. And anyone who's acquainted with grief knows that you don't get to hope by bypassing what's been lost. And sometimes, just sometimes, that is a messy process, and sometimes it just takes time. And if we try and close it off quickly, and it's tempting, believe me, because we can't predict where it takes us, perhaps we'll miss what can happen in the darkest of places. Somehow, as communities of faith, we have to learn to grieve the disappointments and the pain of unfulfilled desires, good or bad. And Mary had to give voice to what she was experiencing, because something happens when we allow the language of grief and lament and disappointment, and dare I say it, even anger, to enter our faith. Do you know where it takes us? It leads us to the one who embodies it all. And we find, just like Mary, he's already there. See, when I read this passage of scripture, what I see is how closely positioned despair and resurrection are. Side by side, Mary's in the garden and she's crying out. Essentially, she's crying out, "Where are you, God?" But she's saying it to Jesus himself without even recognizing it. Jesus already there. And I remember in our darkest moments sitting in a hospital room waiting to give birth and feeling overwhelmed. And my husband Ross looked at me and he said, "Lucy, he is here." And did it make it easy? No. But he stayed with us. Can we learn to recognize his presence with us, to discern him in the midst of our deepest pain, learning to see in the dark? Sometimes in darkness we cry out and we lean into hope. And it's in that longest held yearning that we find an invitation to see Jesus and the hope that he's come just as he promised us he would. N.T. Wright puts it like this: Easter was when hope in person surprised the world by coming forward from the future into the present. His love moves towards us, and he is present. And for some of you today, that's just where you need to start. You don't need to go any further than hearing an invitation to give voice to what you're experiencing and to see that he is already where you are. He's already moved out to meet you. And it's only when we see him, as Mary did, that our reorientation can begin. Because that's what he does in that place of darkness. Suffering's always a challenge to our knowing, the certitude. And the hard places change everything. What we know to be true about God, how we see ourselves and we see the world. And it's completely disorientating, because for me it wasn't just the pain of what I'd lost, it was also the pain of God not doing what I expected him to. It's like a double whammy. And when we lost Jude, my foundations were shaken to their core. I was unsure about everything I knew about God. It doesn't mean that I was right or that somehow God had become a different person. But my way of seeing had changed, and I had to learn how to see God again. I thought I had a pretty good theology of pain and suffering, but until I was living it out, it hadn't really been tested. Do you ever notice when you read this passage of scripture that after Jesus says her name, the first thing he says to her is, "Don't hold on to me." Some translations say, "Don't cling to me." Now, I have a clingy child, and I often am like, "Don't cling to me." I wonder if Mary was just like so excited to see him and he was peeling her off. But it's kind of it feels like a bit of a harsh reality in that moment. She thought Jesus was dead. She thought he was gone, that it was over. And he's like, "Don't hold on to me." Of course, what do we do when we've lost something? We cling on to the thing that we think we've lost. And whenever we go through disorientating times in our lives, the whole landscape in front of us changes. And being reoriented is not a return to normal. It's not going back to normalcy as if nothing's ever happened, because that just can't happen. I remember a couple of months in, someone meeting us and saying, "Are things getting back to normal now?" And I thought, it's not, nothing is normal, and it becomes a new normal. And we often refer to our lives as pre and post Jude, because it changed us. And even the process of grief or loss or disappointment, it isn't a revisiting of old ground, it's unfamiliar territory. And what we find here is Mary finds herself with Jesus in unfamiliar territory. What does this all mean now? See, until this moment, Mary's experienced Jesus in a particular way. And things are not about to return to normal. They're not going to go back to doing what they were doing before all of this happened. Everything has changed. The resurrection has changed everything. And more than this, Jesus knows that in the months to come, the disciples and Mary are going to have to rely on their encounter with the risen Jesus in order to live out their faith when he is no longer physically present with them. Because the truth is, this wasn't the outcome they had been looking for. They'd been hoping for a Messiah who was going to come and overthrow the Romans and lead them into freedom. And this had been a false hope. And I think when we're faced with this changing landscape, when our world has changed, we can do one of two things. The temptation is to lower our theology to match our pain. Maybe I was just wrong about you, God. I remember thinking, I obviously expected too much of you, God. Or maybe this can be a moment, an opportunity to unlearn some things about God that maybe, just maybe, we've gotten wrong and see God for who he really is. Yet these moments in our lives when we experience the "where are you, God?" we need a theology that will allow us to be reoriented not around our situation or our circumstances, but around the absolute goodness of God. And it is a process of letting go of false hope and making way for the resurrected Jesus who makes the dead alive and calls into being the things that are not yet. After Jude, I realized that I had gotten my picture of hope wrong. I used to think that hope was that everything would work out as it should be. A hope of expectation. I hope I won't get sick. I hope I won't lose my job. I hope I get what I want. But of course, when everything goes wrong, what happens to that idea of hope? General Stockdale was a prisoner of war during the Vietnam War. And he was held and tortured for 7 years. But he survived, unlike so many of his fellow prisoners. So what was it that set him apart from his fellow captives? Well, those who didn't survive, they hoped and believed, and they really believed it, that they would be out by Christmas. And then Christmas came and went. And then sometimes another Christmas came and went, and many of them died as a result. And you might say that Stockdale was a realist, but he says that he confronted the brutal facts of his circumstances, but he maintained a belief and a hope that he would prevail in the end. And this story reminds me of a quote by a German theologian called Jürgen Moltmann, and he writes about biblical hope, and he says this: genuine hope is not blind optimism. It is hope with open eyes, which sees the suffering and yet believes in the future. And Moltmann himself was a prisoner of war after the Second World War, and following his own experiences, he became a follower of Christ and began writing about what hope looked like. And I think our hope emerges not from a picture that everything's going to be all right, that everything's going to work out as it should be, but precisely the opposite. That real hope comes after despair, when we realize that the world is not as it should be. And when we've known the deep sadness of unfulfilled dreams and promises, and we look it in the face and we name it for what it is, can we dare to imagine a better way? It's in our grieving and giving voice to it that newness and hope become a real possibility. Brueggemann says hope is subversive precisely because it dares to admit that all is not as it should be. And that's why we cry out, that's why we grieve and we lament, because violence and injustice and oppression and pain, they pervade our lives in the macro and the micro. Today on the streets of Syria and amongst the Rohingya and in South Sudan and in Yemen and in brothels in Southeast Asia, and on the streets of your community and your city, to parents who've lost a child, to husbands and wives who are grieving the death of a marriage, to those who face disappointment and loss of jobs, to those who walk with depression or struggling with infertility or fighting cancer. Our hearts have to cry out, all is not right in this world. And yet, those two words are so important. This is precisely why he came to die. All is not right, and we are in desperate need of the one who brings real peace and the kingdom he is ushering in. Colossians 1:19, for God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. The hope of the resurrection is moving towards these places and spaces. It is the now and the not yet. And that's why we hope. And do you know what? That hope, it doesn't calm us or quiet us. It should make us impatient and restless and desperate for the hope of the coming kingdom to come on earth as it is in heaven. That pull of the promised future pressing into every unfulfilled reality in our lives. And so maybe the season of disappointment is acknowledging that while all is not as it should be, as God's people, we hold out for, we work for, we create, we prophesy into something better. For the kingdom to come, for oaks of righteousness to tower, for leaves to blossom, for the healing of the nations, for swords to be beaten into plowshares, for joy to come in the morning, and for redemption and justice. Hope is a beautiful thing because of the place that it's born in. I remember receiving a word not long after Jude died that the work of spring happens in the darkness of winter. And so we hope with open eyes, which sees the suffering and yet believes in the future. I'm just going to finish. I just want us to come back for one moment to Mary. She's the one who stayed by the tomb in the midst of her grief. She stayed. You know, I think in the church we have a great theology of going and being sent, and it's so important. But you know, it's not often in the church we talk about the holy work of showing up and staying put. Showing up when it's a little bit less glamorous and adventurous to go. Showing up when it's mundane and, dare I say it, sometimes a bit boring. Sometimes showing up when it looks like nothing is happening, or for like Mary, you are consumed with pain and loss and grief. And what follows is this beautiful encounter. Because Mary showed up, she got to be the first to encounter the risen Jesus. And we see it time and time again when life gets hard, the temptations to run and hide. And we find ourselves in this passage back in a familiar place, back in a garden. And the same God who initiates an intimacy with Adam and Eve initiates another intimate moment. You know, Mary's witnessing a risen Jesus, but there's no fireworks. He simply says her name, an expression of being known by him. And I love this end. He tells us that, you know, in John's gospel, until this moment, he is referred to Mary in her Greek form of her name, Maria, what she would have been known on the streets. The soldiers at the foot of the cross would have called her. But you know, she stands before Jesus and she pours out her grief to him. He addresses her with her biblical name. In the Aramaic or Hebrew, Miriam. The name that her dad and her mum would have called her at home. A name which says, Miriam, it's me, I know you, and it's going to be all right. I am alive, and you are now my messenger of this great hope. And I just felt like this morning, some of you just need to be encouraged to just keep showing up. If it seems like all is lost, and you feel a little bit overwhelmed, what if you just kept showing up? You might get to encounter resurrection in the midst of death or despair or emptiness. Hebrews 10:23-25. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. Encourage one another in this community to be people who keep showing up to the people and the places and situations that he's placed you in, because there's an invitation to see him and to encounter his resurrection. And you know, Mary didn't expect to see a risen Jesus. She thought he was the gardener. And he rarely shows up how we expect him to. And that's the beauty of the surprise of the resurrection. It's almost when we just thought it wasn't possible that we see him. And I have just a photo to finish with. I don't know if it's there. There she is. You know, this was our surprise, our gift of hope. This is Iris, our fourth child. And her name means rainbow. Because, you know, I'm not just looking for a happy ending this morning. And you know, having her didn't minimize, it didn't even alter our loss. But she was a reminder of the God who makes all things new. And she was a reason to hope again. And we take note of these small, surprising moments, these gifts of grace in the midst of pain. They are radical acts of hope. Sometimes I feel like it doesn't take much to disorientate me these days. Just have to switch on the news. But I'm learning that in the midst of those times, to look for him, to listen for him calling my name, and to lean into the pain. It's okay. It's okay to give expression to what we're feeling, to give voice to it, because it's in that place that newness and hope become a real possibility, that we see the suffering, but we live in that and yet moment, that we believe in his kingdom coming on earth as it is in heaven. Why don't we just stand together